It didn't begin with a headline, it began with a whisper, buried deep within the corridors of Balmoral. A quiet exchange between auditors, sealed documents, and a name no one expected to hear: Sophie. Within hours, palace aides were scrambling, conversations were cut short, and a truth long buried beneath royal protocol began clawing its way to the surface. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was dismissed as nothing more than routine housekeeping and internal review, the kind that happens quietly and disappears just as quickly. But something about this was different. Those familiar with the rhythms of royal administration began to notice subtle disruptions. Meetings were being called at unusual hours. Senior aides, usually composed and unshakable, were suddenly guarded, their words measured, their expressions unreadable. And then came the silence, the kind of silence that doesn't calm but unsettles. Conversations that once flowed freely were abruptly cut short. Doors that were typically open were now firmly closed. The whispers began to circulate among those closest to the inner workings of the monarchy. Reports suggested there was a discrepancy, small on paper perhaps, but profound in implication, tied to the historic estate of Birkhall. At first glance, it seemed technical, almost mundane. But as insiders would later hint, the issue wasn't just about paperwork. It was about ownership, about legacy, about who truly held claim over one of the monarchy's most quietly significant properties. And then, almost imperceptibly, a name entered the conversation: Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Not in public statements, not in official briefings, but in hushed tones behind closed doors. Insiders whisper that her involvement wasn't anticipated, and certainly not welcomed by everyone. She was quietly summoned into private consultations, her presence signaling that this was not longer a routine review. This was something deeper, something far more consequential. Tension began to ripple through the senior ranks of the royal household. Those who had long operated with certainty suddenly found themselves questioning what they thought they knew. If the early suggestions were true, that ownership records did not align with long-held assumptions, then the implications were staggering. It wasn't just about correcting an error. It was about confronting the possibility that a foundational belief within the royal structure had been wrong all along. Meanwhile, beyond palace walls, the media began to sense that something was shifting. Not through official channels, but through subtle cues: the absence of denial, the careful wording of statements, the unmistakable tightening of control. Media insiders claimed that something was off, that there had been signs for weeks, perhaps even months, that a larger story was waiting to break. And now, those fragments were beginning to align. What made it even more unsettling was the speed at which the situation escalated. One moment, it was a whisper. The next, it was a question no one could ignore. And at the center of it all stood a figure who had long operated with quiet dignity, now unexpectedly drawn into a storm that threatened to reshape perceptions of power, inheritance, and truth within the monarchy itself. But what began as a whisper quickly unraveled into something far more explosive: a decades-old paper trail that refused to stay hidden. Birkhall was never just a house, it was a sanctuary, a symbol of continuity within the fragile architecture of royal legacy. And now, that sanctuary stood at the center of a growing storm. For generations, Birkhall existed not merely as a residence, but as something far more intimate, a retreat woven into the emotional fabric of the monarchy itself. Tucked within the vast and storied lands of Balmoral Castle, it carried a quieter presence, less grand in scale, yet heavier in meaning. It was the kind of place that did not need spectacle to assert its importance. Those familiar with the rhythms of royal life often described it as a refuge, a place where the weight of duty softened, even if only briefly. And for King Charles III, that connection ran deep, shaped over decades of private moments and unspoken tradition. But what gave Birkhall its emotional gravity also made it uniquely vulnerable to scrutiny. Because within the monarchy, sentiment does not always align with structure. There is a difference, subtle, yet powerful, between what is cherished and what is owned. And it is within that difference that tension begins to build. The monarchy operates on layers of possession that are rarely visible to the public eye. Some properties belong to the crown, held in trust for the nation. Others exist as private holdings, passed quietly through generations. And then there are those rare estates that seem to exist somewhere in between, wrapped in tradition, yet bound by legal definitions that can shift under pressure. Reports suggest that Birkhall may have been one of those rare cases. For years, its place within the royal structure appeared unquestioned. It was spoken of with certainty, its status assumed rather than examined. But as insiders began to revisit the details, a more complicated picture started to emerge. Different interpretations of historical records hinted that the estate's ownership might not be as straightforward as it seemed. Was it truly a personal possession, or did it fall within a broader framework of royal assets? And if so, who ultimately held the legal claim? These were not simple questions. They struck at the heart of how royal legacy is preserved and who gets to define it. Because Birkhall was not just another piece of land. It represented continuity, a link between past and present, a symbol of stability in an institution that depends on carefully maintained tradition. To challenge its ownership was to challenge more than paperwork. It was to question the very narrative that had been built around it. As the whispers from the previous revelations began to merge with the weight of Birkhall's history, the stakes grew heavier. What had once seemed like a quiet discrepancy now carried the potential to reshape long-held assumptions about inheritance, authority, and control. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the realization that this was not a new issue. It had simply remained hidden, protected by time, silence, and the unspoken agreement not to look too closely. And it was within those distinctions between sentiment and legality that the real conflict began to take shape. The truth wasn't discovered overnight. It was uncovered line by line, buried in decades-old documents that were never meant to be questioned. What began as a quiet internal review soon evolved into something far more deliberate, far more calculated. Independent auditors, figures who typically operate far from the public gaze, were quietly brought in to examine the estate records tied to Birkhall. Their role, at least on paper, was routine: verify documentation, confirm ownership structures, ensure alignment with established legal frameworks. But those familiar with the process suggest that the moment they began their work, it became clear this was no ordinary audit. There were gaps, subtle at first, easy to overlook if one wasn't looking closely, and so they looked closer. What they found did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a series of unsettling fragments. Ownership filings that didn't quite match earlier records, inheritance documentation that hinted at alternative interpretations, transfers that appeared valid on the surface, yet raised quiet questions when placed within a broader legal context. It wasn't chaos, it was something more dangerous. Precision with inconsistencies. A structure that held together just enough to avoid scrutiny, but not enough to withstand it. Reports suggest that much this complexity stemmed from the intricate web of legal mechanisms that govern royal assets. Trusts layered upon trusts. Private holdings intertwined with historically protected estates. Transfers executed under conditions that, while not necessarily improper, were open to interpretation. And in a system where interpretation can define reality, that ambiguity became the center of the storm. It was within this web that a crucial detail began to emerge, one that shifted the entire narrative. Evidence, carefully examined and cross-referenced, appeared to suggest that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, held a legal position far stronger than anyone had previously acknowledged. Not through sudden intervention, not through force, but through something far quieter and far more powerful. Documentation. The kind that doesn't shout, but endures. For those within palace circles, the implications were immediate and deeply unsettling. Insiders whisper that the findings were met not with denial, but with a kind of stunned silence. Because this wasn't just about correcting an administrative oversight. It was about confronting the possibility that a long-standing assumption one accepted without question might be fundamentally flawed. And if that assumption could be wrong, what else might be? The deeper the auditors went, the more difficult it became to contain the narrative. Each document added weight. Each discrepancy sharpened the tension. What had once been treated as settled fact was now being re-examined under a harsher, more unforgiving light. And with every line reviewed, the balance of certainty began to shift. There was no dramatic moment of discovery, no single piece of evidence that changed everything. Instead, it was the accumulation of the slow, relentless build of detail that left little room for doubt. A truth not declared, but revealed through persistence. And as that truth took shape, it carried with it a quiet but undeniable force, one that could not easily be dismissed or ignored. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. What came next would test loyalties at the highest level. When the findings reached the palace, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. There was no time to soften the impact, no space to quietly absorb what had been uncovered. Reports suggest that within hours of the auditors' conclusions being circulated among the highest levels of the royal household, emergency meetings were convened with an urgency rarely seen. Senior royals, legal advisors, and long-trusted private secretaries were drawn into a tightening circle of discussion, each carrying their own interpretation of what the revelations truly meant. The atmosphere, according to those familiar with the proceedings, was not one of chaos but of controlled tension, the kind that simmers beneath carefully chosen words and measured responses. At the center of this unfolding storm stood Prince Edward, a figure often described as steady, precise, and deeply attuned to the finer details of royal structure. But this was not a situation that could be resolved through quiet administration alone. He found himself navigating a landscape where law and legacy were no longer aligned, where the preservation of tradition was suddenly at odds with the weight of documented reality. And in that space, every decision carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. The tension was not simply procedural, it was deeply personal. Because to acknowledge the findings was to accept that a long-standing narrative within the monarchy might no longer hold. And for an institution built on continuity, that realization carried an emotional weight that could not easily be dismissed. Some, insiders whisper, argued for caution, for restraint, for a way to contain the situation without allowing it to disrupt the carefully maintained balance of royal order. Others, however, recognized a harsher truth that ignoring the evidence would only deepen the fracture. Different interpretations of those closed-door discussions describe moments of quiet disagreement, where voices remained calm but convictions clashed beneath the surface. This was not open conflict. It was something more controlled, more calculated, a battle fought through perspective, through strategy, through the delicate art of deciding what should be acknowledged and what should remain unsaid. Because in the monarchy, silence is not absence. It is a tool. And in this moment, it was being wielded with precision. Palace aides, caught between these competing forces, were given clear and unmistakable instructions. Maintain silence. Offer nothing beyond the most carefully prepared statements. Allow no hint of uncertainty to reach beyond the palace gates. It was an effort to contain the narrative, to hold the line while decisions were still being shaped behind closed doors. But even the most disciplined silence has its limits. Outside, the pressure was building. Media outlets already attuned to the earlier whispers began to sense that something far more significant was unfolding. Insiders claimed that fragments of information, small, incomplete, but unmistakably real, started to leak into public discourse. Not enough to tell the full story, but enough to raise questions. Enough to create a sense that the official silence was hiding something far larger than routine clarification. And that was the danger. Because once doubt enters the narrative, it becomes difficult to control. The palace could manage its statements, its appearances, its carefully constructed image. But it could not fully contain the growing awareness that a fundamental issue, one tied to ownership, to legitimacy, to the very structure of royal inheritance, was now under scrutiny. Yet behind closed doors, one question loomed larger than all the rest. What would this mean for the future of the crown's most sacred holdings? The verdict didn't come with fanfare, but its impact was undeniable. Ink on paper had done what years of assumption could not. There was no grand announcement, no formal declaration delivered from palace steps. Instead, the confirmation arrived quietly, almost deliberately understated, as if those responsible understood the weight of what had just been set in motion. The final audit results, carefully reviewed, meticulously verified, left little room for interpretation. Reports suggest that the documentation aligned with a conclusion that many had not anticipated, and some had actively resisted. The legal standing of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, in relation to Birkhall was not only valid, it was stronger than previously acknowledged. For those within the palace, the shift was immediate, even if it was not openly spoken. What had once been approached with hesitation, even quiet denial, began to transform into reluctant acceptance. Insiders whisper that conversations changed tone almost overnight. Language softened. certainty replaced ambiguity. The same voices that had once questioned the implications of the audit now found themselves navigating a new reality, one in which the evidence could no longer be reframed or delayed. The acknowledgement itself was subtle, almost imperceptible to those outside the inner circle. There were no sweeping statements, no dramatic reversals. But within the palace structure, even the smallest change carries meaning. References to Birkhall began to shift carefully, precisely, as though each word had been weighed before being spoken. What was once described with broad assumption was now framed with deliberate clarity. It was not a public correction, but it was a correction nonetheless. And for those paying close attention, it spoke volumes. Beyond the palace walls, the narrative began to evolve in parallel. Media outlets, long fueled by speculation and fragments of information, started to align their reporting with what insiders had already begun to accept. Different interpretations of the situation gave way to a more unified understanding, one that reflected the findings rather than the uncertainty that had preceded them. It was not a sudden shift, but a gradual convergence where public perception slowly caught up with private reality. And at the center of it all stood Sophie, not as a figure seeking recognition, but as one whose position had been quietly, undeniably reinforced. There was no outward display of triumph, no attempt to reshape the narrative in her favor. Yet the significance of the moment was impossible to ignore. Her vindication did not come through declaration, but through endurance, through patience, through the steady, unyielding presence of documented truth. What made it all the more powerful was the contrast. Where there had once been doubt, there was now clarity. Where there had been resistance, there was now acceptance. And in that transformation lay something far deeper than a simple resolution. It was a reminder, quiet but unmistakable, that within the monarchy, legacy is not only preserved through tradition, but tested through scrutiny. But victory within palace walls rarely comes without consequence, and this revelation was no exception. Vindication brought clarity, but it also unleashed a wave of consequences that rippled far beyond Birkhall itself. What had been resolved on paper did not settle quietly within the institution. Instead, it triggered a deeper, more unsettling process, one that forced the monarchy to look inward. Reports suggest that the confirmation of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh's position regarding Birkhall prompted an immediate reassessment of other royal properties, many of which had long existed under similar layers of assumption and tradition. Because if one estate could be misunderstood, even unintentionally, then the question became impossible to ignore how many others might carry the same hidden complexities. This was no longer a contained issue. It was a shift. Quiet at first, but undeniably expanding. Legal teams, advisors, and long-standing custodians of royal records reportedly began revisiting documentation that had not been scrutinized in decades. Not publicly, not dramatically, but with a level of care that revealed just how seriously the situation was being taken behind closed doors. Each document re-examined, each structure reconsidered, added to a growing sense that the monarchy was entering a phase of internal correction, one driven not by external pressure, but by the weight of its own discoveries. But while the process was procedural on the surface, the emotional undercurrents were far more complex. Insiders whisper that the revelation created subtle but undeniable strain among senior royals. Not through open conflict, but through shifting dynamics, moments of hesitation where there had once been certainty, quiet recalibrations of trust where assumptions had previously gone unquestioned. Because this was not just about legal clarity. It was about perception, about who had known, who had not, and what that meant for relationships built over years of shared responsibility. Outside the palace, the scrutiny intensified. The public, already attuned to the unfolding narrative, began to ask sharper questions. Media outlets, drawing on fragments of insider insight and emerging confirmations, started framing the situation as something more than a simple correction. Some described it as a royal adjustment, others as a necessary realignment. But beneath those interpretations was a consistent theme: the idea that the monarchy, for all its structure and tradition, was not immune to oversight. That even within its most protected systems, errors, however unintentional, could exist. That perception carried weight, because the monarchy does not operate solely on authority, it operates on trust. And with that trust came expectation. Questions began to surface about past decisions, about how certain structures had been allowed to stand without challenge, about whether oversight had been as rigorous as it was believed to be. Not accusations, not outright criticism, but something more persistent: curiosity, doubt, the kind that lingers. In response, efforts to stabilize the narrative quietly took shape. Statements remained measured. Language remained careful. There was no attempt to dramatize the correction, no desire to amplify what had already drawn significant attention. Instead, the approach was controlled, deliberate, an effort to absorb the impact without allowing it to fracture the broader image of continuity and stability that the monarchy depends on. And yet, even within that control, the shift could be felt, because something had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. The certainty that once surrounded certain aspects of royal structure had been replaced with a more cautious awareness, a recognition that legacy, no matter how firmly established, is not beyond question. And as the dust began to settle, a deeper truth started to emerge, one that spoke not just of property but of power. This was never just about land, it was about leverage, legacy, and the quiet reshaping of royal power. What began as a question of ownership had now evolved into something far more consequential. Because within the monarchy, power does not always announce itself, it shifts, subtly, through moments like these. Reports suggest that the confirmation surrounding Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh and Birkhall, did more than resolve a legal ambiguity. It repositioned her within the intricate hierarchy of the royal family. Not through proclamation, not through ceremony, but through recognition, quiet, deliberate, and deeply significant. Those familiar with the internal dynamics of the monarchy began to notice the change almost immediately. It wasn't visible in grand gestures, but in tone, in presence, in the subtle recalibration of influence that defines how decisions are shaped behind closed doors. Sophie, long regarded as steady and dependable, was now seen through a different lens, one that acknowledged not only her role, but her authority within the evolving structure. And standing beside her, Prince Edward appeared equally strengthened, their partnership taking on a renewed sense of strategic importance. This shift did not disrupt the monarchy, it refined it. Because the institution has always relied on balance, on the careful distribution of responsibility among those who uphold its continuity. But balance is not static, it adapts. And in moments of pressure, it reveals where strength truly lies. Insiders whisper that roles once assumed to be fixed are now being quietly reconsidered, not through dramatic restructuring, but through gradual realignment. A recognition that the future of the monarchy may depend on those who have proven their resilience when it mattered most. The implications extend far beyond the present moment, because inheritance within the royal framework is not only about succession, it is about stewardship, about who is trusted to preserve what has been passed down and how that trust is defined. The situation surrounding Birkhall has introduced a new level of scrutiny into that process, one that may influence how future decisions are approached. Not with hesitation, but with a heightened awareness that clarity is not optional, it is essential. At the same time, the monarchy continues to evolve under pressures both internal and external. Public expectations are shifting. Transparency, once carefully managed, is now increasingly demanded. And within that environment, the importance of legal precision becomes even more pronounced. Because in an institution where perception and reality are so closely intertwined, even the smallest uncertainty can carry disproportionate weight. What this moment has revealed is not weakness, but adaptability. A willingness, however quiet, to confront complexity rather than avoid it, to correct rather than conceal, and in doing so to reinforce the very stability that the monarchy depends on. Because in the end, what was reclaimed wasn't just an estate, it was something far more enduring. In the quiet aftermath, as the headlines faded and the palace doors closed once more, one truth remained: some battles are fought not with voices, but with patience, precision, and time. What had once been framed as uncertainty, even quiet controversy, now settled into something far more enduring, a narrative not of conflict, but of resilience. Because at the center of it all, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, did not emerge through force or confrontation. She endured. She waited. And in doing so, her story was slowly rewritten, not by declaration, but by the steady accumulation of truth. Reports suggest that those within the palace began to see her not simply as a participant in the unfolding situation, but as a figure defined by restraint, someone who allowed the process to speak on her behalf, even when silence may have felt like vulnerability. There is a quiet power in that kind of restraint. Because in an institution as deeply rooted in tradition as the monarchy, change rarely arrives with noise. It arrives through correction, through the willingness to revisit what has long been accepted and to acknowledge, however carefully, that even the most established systems are not beyond refinement. And in this moment, that willingness became unmistakable. The monarchy did not collapse under scrutiny, it adapted to it. It absorbed the pressure, recalibrated, and in doing so, reaffirmed the very principles it seeks to uphold. At the heart of that recalibration was a simple but profound idea: the prioritization of duty over assumption. For years, certain beliefs about ownership and legacy had gone unquestioned, not out of negligence, but out of trust in continuity. Yet when that trust was challenged, the response was not denial, it was correction. And that correction, however quiet, carried a message that extended far beyond the immediate situation. It reinforced the notion that legacy is not preserved by clinging to certainty, but by ensuring that certainty is deserved. And so, Birkhall took on a new meaning. No longer just a sanctuary or a symbol of personal connection, it became something more: a representation of restored balance, a place where history and legality, sentiment and structure, finally aligned. It stood not as a point of contention, but as evidence that even within the most complex systems, clarity can prevail. What makes this moment resonate is not its scale, but its subtlety. There were no sweeping declarations, no dramatic turning points visible to the outside world. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The monarchy had faced a quiet challenge and met it with equal quiet strength. It had demonstrated that even within an institution defined by centuries of tradition, there remains space for reflection, for adjustment, for truth to emerge without disruption. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson, that within the silence, within the patience, within the slow and deliberate process of uncovering what was once hidden, there exists a form of power that cannot be easily undone. A power rooted not in control, but in integrity. Because in the House of Windsor, legacy is never given, it is proven. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.